Buried in a riverbed in southern India is a layer of ash from an eruption some scientists say should have killed almost everyone on Earth. The stone tools resting on top of it look exactly like the ones underneath. Nobody staged that. It was just sitting there, waiting to be dug up. Look at your own hand. Follow every ancestor who ever held it up to a fire, generation after generation, and the line narrows, down to a population small enough that researchers have put the number as low as 3,000 people. In 1998, geologist Stanley Ambrose proposed why. 74,000 years ago, a volcano in what is now Indonesia erupted with a force estimated at more than 10,000 times the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens. The ash and sulfur it threw skyward, he argued, triggered a volcanic winter, severe enough to nearly finish us before we had properly started. For decades, that story has been repeated in documentaries and textbooks as settled fact. It even explained something strange about our own biology. Humans today carry less genetic variation than a single troop of wild chimpanzees. 3,000 people. That is not a nation. That is barely a small town. The scale of it is hard to hold in your head. Toba threw out roughly 2,800 cubic kilometers of rock and ash. Spread evenly, that is enough to bury the entire continental United States nearly a foot deep. Ash from the eruption settled across an area larger than India itself, reaching the Arabian Sea in one direction and the South China Sea in the other. At a site called Jwalapuram in southern India, the ash itself lies as much as 2 meters thick. Fine traces of it have turned up frozen into ice cores in Greenland, nearly 7,000 miles from the crater. Sulfur pumped high into the stratosphere is thought to have cooled the planet for years afterward, disrupting monsoon rains that entire ecosystems depended on. Forests thinned, rivers ran differently. If the volcanic winter hypothesis was right, this was never a regional disaster. It was large enough to threaten every population of modern humans alive at the time, on every continent they had reached, from Africa to India to the edge of Southeast Asia. And somewhere inside that ash cloud, the story went. Our species came closer to disappearing than at any other point in its history. You have probably heard some version of this story. The volcano nearly ended us. It has been repeated in documentaries, magazine features, even biology textbooks, for almost 30 years. It is the kind of detail that makes a good story stick. Humanity clawing back from the edge of a volcanic winter. But when archaeologists actually went looking for the bodies, for abandoned camps, for a sudden gap in the tool record, for any sign of a species in freefall, they kept finding the opposite. Not devastation, continuity, people making the same tools in the same places on both sides of the ash. Start with the dirt itself. In 2007, archaeologists digging at Jwalapuram in southern India pulled more than 15,000 stone tools out of the ground, sorted into over 20 distinct categories. Some came from below the Toba ash. Some came from directly above it. The flaking patterns, the raw materials, the whole technological signature were nearly identical on both sides. Whoever was there before the eruption was still there after it, solving the same problems the way they always had. That alone was a problem for the catastrophe story. Then an identical pattern turned up somewhere Toba's ash should never have reached in force, the south coast of Africa. At Pinnacle Point, researchers led by Curtis Marian found microscopic glass shards from the eruption itself, buried inside a site where people were still living, working stone, eating shellfish off the rocks. And in 2024, a team including Marian published evidence from a river valley in Ethiopia showing something even stranger. Right through the ash layer, people there were fishing intensively in a shrinking seasonal river and using what may be the earliest evidence anywhere of the bow and arrow. That is simply not the record of a species in decline. That is a species solving a drought. 2 continents, 2 independent teams decades apart. One answer written into the ground both times. Some researchers still push back on this picture. They point out that the strongest continuity evidence comes from refugia, far southern India, the South African coast, places that may simply have been sheltered from the worst of it, and argue that a real collapse closer to the volcano in Sumatra and the surrounding region cannot be ruled out just because the far edges of its reach look fine. It is a fair point. Direct evidence from the blast zone itself was mostly erased by the blast, but if nothing happened to the population, something else clearly did. Human DNA still carries the signature of a real narrowing, a stretch when our species passed through a genuinely small breeding population. That signal is not a guess. It is not a subtle statistical wobble either. It shows up again and again in genetic studies run years apart, using different methods on different populations by scientists who were not even setting out to confirm each other's work. So if the volcano did not do it, what did? The answer took another decade of genetic work to surface, and it was never the volcano. As whole genome sequencing improved through the 2000s, researchers kept refining exactly when that narrow point occurred, and the date kept sliding away from 74,000 years ago. Several studies now place it closer to 50,000 years ago, matching not a global catastrophe but something far more ordinary. A small founding group leaving Africa, carrying only a fraction of the species' genetic variation with them, the way any small group splitting from a larger population always does. Other reconstructions pushed the narrowing back even further, to a cold, dry stretch of climate more than 100,000 years before Toba erupted at all. Either way, the timing that once looked like a smoking gun was never actually aimed at the volcano. The narrow point was real. The volcano was just never the reason. So did the volcano almost end us? No. Not in the way the story says. Toba damaged forests and disrupted monsoons across a broad stretch of the planet, and for people living close enough to the ashfall, the years afterward were almost certainly harder. But the mass die-off, a species clinging to survival in a handful of tropical refugees, never shows up in the ground. What shows up instead is people in India and people in Africa, thousands of miles apart, making the same tools, eating off the same rocks before and after the eruption, adapting to a hard decade rather than nearly disappearing because of one. Remember the narrow point in your own family tree from the start of this video. That population squeeze written into our DNA was real. It just happened for a different reason, probably tens of thousands of years earlier or later than 74,000. Tangled up with ordinary migration out of Africa and ordinary climate cycles, not a single afternoon in Sumatra. Zoom out and the pattern is bigger than one eruption. Homo sapiens is a species that has weathered ice ages, mega droughts, and volcanic winters, not by avoiding disaster, but by being flexible enough to outlast it. That correction did not happen overnight either. It is part of a pattern still playing out today, as better genetic tools and better dating methods keep pushing scientists to revisit conclusions that once looked settled on this question and plenty of others. And the correction itself says something about how science actually works, something worth remembering long after this particular volcano stops being interesting. A dramatic, satisfying story took nearly 2 decades and 3 separate excavation teams on 2 continents to unravel. Not because anyone was careless the first time, because good evidence takes time to accumulate against a good story. So no, the volcano did not nearly end us. If anything, the story of nearly ending us is the part that came closest to lasting forever. Repeated in classrooms and documentaries for 30 years, before anyone thought to match the tools on both sides of the ash. The volcano did not end us. What almost did was believing it for 3 decades, before anyone bothered to check the dirt.